2023 saw the release of 4 DCEU movies, which, while by far the most amount of DCEU projects from one year, it's also the ending of the DCEU, and despite the large number of movies, the universe went out, rather fittingly, with a bit of a whimper. Still, while the DCEU doesn't come close to comparing to something like the MCU's Infinity Saga, it wasn't all bad. And now that it has ended, this would be a good opportunity to look at the 16 movies and 1 show of the DC Extended Universe, and rank them from worst to best for the last time. Remember, this is entirely my opinion. Leave your own in the comments down below, and make sure to subscribe. Let's begin. Wonder Woman 1984 is astonishingly bad, like potentially the single worst modern day comic book movie. The writing and dialogue feels like something out of a bad 80s Saturday morning cartoon. None of the characters feel like real people. The movie is riddled with super noticeable green screens, and the entire conflict of the movie involving the Dreamstone makes no sense. Like, why didn't Lord turn into an actual stone? Why did Barbara turn into a cheetah? And why the hell did Steve Trevor have to replace someone else's body only for Diana to then exploit it, which was so weird? Wonder Woman 1984 is cheesy, ridiculous, overly long, difficult to watch, and potentially the single biggest downgrade a comic book movie sequel has ever had. My thoughts on Birds of Prey are decently encapsulated by its original title, Birds of Prey and the Fantabulous Emancipation of One Harley Quinn, a ridiculous title that shows the creators of this movie maybe had too much free reign. I'll be honest, I've been pretty sick of the character of Harley Quinn for a while now, and Birds of Prey is the character at her most insufferable, getting away with everything, being used as the protagonist, and even her design sucks now, and so does everyone else's. It doesn't help that aside from maybe the Huntress, who was adapted well, none of the other characters really resemble the comic book counterparts. I especially hate this portrayal of Cassandra Cain. This leaves Birds of Prey feeling too disconnected from the source material, while definitely not changing up enough and making it better to justify that. Every other technical aspect of the movie, as well as the writing and acting, is fine at best. I just personally have zero interest in a comic book movie that clearly has no interest in its comic book characters. Suicide Squad is such a nothing burger of a movie, a drab movie starring a boring Suicide Squad lineup, which butchers characters like Joker, Killer Croc, Katana, and even Rick Flag, while admittedly portraying Amanda Waller, Harley Quinn, and at times Deadshot rather well. The plot never really goes beyond the general concept of the Suicide Squad. Villains are forced by Amanda Waller to go fight a bigger threat, and the character interactions, visuals, and main conflict never do anything to expand or add to that. I initially didn't really hate this movie, but not only have I never had the desire to rewatch it, but also its sequel further brought to light everything Suicide Squad did wrong or didn't do at all. We'll get to that far later on the list. I absolutely despise this version of the Flash. He's weird and annoying, doesn't look like the character, he even runs weird. Barring a recast, this movie could have only ever been so good, and Ezra Miller isn't even the end of this movie's problems. The apparently purposefully untextured CGI is horrendous to look at, and not made better by being intentional. It might be made worse. The comedy almost never lands, and having a second, even more annoying Barry was a terrible decision. The plot becomes a bit nonsensical by the end. The main villain, while cool looking, doesn't get nearly enough screen time or even a single fight scene, and is pretty much just a poor rehash of Savitar from the CW show. Also, the scenes involving Barry's mom or dad are a poor rehash of what they did on the CW show, as they just pale in comparison. They don't reach a modicum of the emotion. It's not all bad. Supergirl and Batman are kinda cool, although limited in their screen time. Some of the plot elements are respectable, and there's at least one good running scene, but then there's the baby scene, or the cameos, which are probably the 2 worst scenes the DCU has ever given us. It sucks because the Flash is my favorite DC character, but this movie is a huge disappointment that honestly I've liked less and less over time, and honestly, it was doomed from the moment Ezra Miller was cast, 9 years before the movie came out. If Suicide Squad is a nothing burger, then Shazam! Fury of the Gods doesn't really even deserve the burger part. It's the single most mediocre and forgettable superhero movie I've seen in years. It's higher on the list because it's certainly better written and at least has some heart, but it's arguably more forgettable. Fury of the Gods further expands on the single biggest issue with the first Shazam movie. Billy and Shazam feel like completely different people, mostly defeating the purpose of the character. Furthermore, the messy lack of cohesion of this universe is brought to light as releasing just 6 months prior to this was Black Adam, a movie that is actually a bit better than this, but also it's about Shazam's arch enemy whose main actor wanted nothing to do with Shazam. For some reason, they didn't also want to go with Mr. Mind, who was set up by the previous movie, and instead forgo Shazam's Rose Gallery altogether and go for these forgettable original villains. Beyond that, Fury of the Gods doesn't do anything interesting with its side characters, is riddled with a lot of very noticeable product placement, and has an absolutely awful Wonder Woman cameo ending. The movie makes me kinda not want to see another Shazam movie for a while, and honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if he's not included in the DCU at all. And considering its box office, that's probably the reality going forward. After a few years of weak build-up, Justice League was a disappointing whimper of a movie that kind of broke the DCEU, between a weirdly comedic Batman, a half-baked Cyborg, and a terribly cast Flash. The Justice League lineup leaves much to be desired in an ugly, mangled-together movie with two conflicting tones from two different directors, a weak plot, a poorly designed and underdeveloped villain, ugly visuals, forgettable character interactions and action scenes, in a Justice League movie that does nothing to make any member outside of Superman feel necessary to the conflict. Justice League could have been something special, and it kind of was, as a cinematic universe-killing movie from which the DCEU never really recovered. I hate that this movie exists. Black Adam being given his own movie just 6 months before Shazam movie that then wasn't able to use him, made for two mediocre movies instead of one potentially good one. Dwayne Johnson is good at playing himself, but he really cannot be asked to play anything beyond that, so Black Adam comes off as incredibly wooden and boring. Beyond that, I heavily dislike how heroic they made him here. I mean, considering how often he said he's not a hero in this movie, it's a bit weird that he came off as one of the most heroic protagonists in the DCEU. The JSA are certainly the highlight, if nothing else, in their designs and characteristics, but things like Dr. Fate constantly taking off his helmet, the JSA for some reason working for Amanda Waller, then needing Black Adam's help to defeat a villain, and Fate's death mostly undermined them as well. The one thing I'd say this movie shines in is the action. It's unique, it's creative and exciting, but I really can't say the same about the rest of the movie. I dislike that this movie exists, but I don't absolutely hate this movie. I think it does some things well. Maybe it's Justice League that killed the DCEU, or maybe it was dead from the start, as Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice wasn't really all that much better. I'm counting the two versions of the movie as the same, as even if they are different movies, the Ultimate Edition is pretty much equal in quality anyway. The plot is expanded on and makes a bit more sense, but the pacing is worsened, so it pretty much evens out. But even in the Ultimate Edition, the plot is so messy and overly convoluted, and never for a second justifies the need for a Batman vs Superman fight. Even worse, when they do fight, their fight ending with them being friends is certainly not justified either. The Martha moment is obviously very stupid, but BVS is absolutely littered with iconic characters that it's clear Zack Snyder simply did not understand in the slightest. Superman is a charmless, depressed, and hopeless slog whose death is devoid of emotion. Batman is a murderous psychopath. Luthor is a quirky weirdo. Jimmy Olsen is a CIA agent who's instantly killed off, and then Doomsday is an ugly, wet, gross monster. It's like this weird, dark, alternate universe where nothing is quite right. There are some fantastic action scenes, the tone is very consistent. I love the Batsuit, and Wonder Woman is given a really great introduction, but this is a movie that seems like it hates the DC Universe, which is probably not how you should kick off your DC Universe. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom is another in a long line of DCEU sequels that doesn't live up to its predecessor and will not be getting a sequel in its own right. Promising another take on Black Manta, the movie absolutely nails his design. I love it. And it nails the Aquaman hatred. There are some interactions between the two that are gold. Unfortunately, he's undermined as a villain, as the worst part of the movie, the Lost Kingdom and its ruler, takes focus in the end. I do not understand why they couldn't commit to Black Manta as the main villain. He's so much more compelling than the actual main villain, it's absurd. Aquaman himself kind of follows Thor in both going too far with the comedy elements and quirkiness, making for his least compelling full movie appearance. and in turning his villainous brother to his side. I will say, Orm absolutely stole the show here. He's got a great arc, is more badass, and is better acted than Aquaman himself, while also being the only source of comedy in this movie that is consistent. Honestly, throughout the movie, I couldn't help but notice how Orm looks a lot more like comic Aquaman than Jason Momoa does. And while I really liked Momoa in the first movie, in this one, his over-the-top mannerisms seeped through far more, which made Arthur kind of unlikable and made Orm look more reasonable, sane, and compelling in comparison. The CGI, especially in the action scenes, is sometimes really bad and unfinished, although, like the first movie, the environments and underwater effects look absolutely amazing. I love the visuals of the Aquaman movies. It's a shame that we won't be getting more of it. There's a weird editing recurrence of slowing down the frame rate, which looks absolutely terrible. It happens a few times, and it took me right out of the movie every single time. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom is a fitting send-off to the DCEU, not as some epic conclusion, but as a perfectly fine, fun, standalone adventure that honestly will make absolutely no impact beyond maybe Aquaman just not getting another movie for a very long time, because it probably won't make very much money. Man of Steel was a decent start to the DCEU, but not a perfect one. I do think it certainly could have been followed up on with a great cinematic universe. Man of Steel has some of the best action in comic book movie history, a great villain, fascinating Kryptonian world building and visuals, fantastic music, and even a really good Superman suit. Where this movie falters, although not nearly as much as Batman vs. Superman, is again in its characterization of Superman, and as an extension of that, its characterization of Jonathan Kent. From the get-go, this at times felt like a weird, dark alternate DC universe where things, again, aren't quite right. A universe where Jonathan Kent taught Clark that hiding his powers is more important than helping people, even going so far to tell Clark to let himself die rather than reveal himself to the world. It's a hard thing to get past. Within the context of the movie, it makes sense that Clark turns out the way he does, broody and reserved, but that just is not Superman. And honestly, it kind of affects other aspects of the movie as well. Like, I don't think that Clark and Lois have a very good dynamic. A part of that might be that this just doesn't feel like Superman for the most part. It's a good movie, but an absolutely terrible portrayal of the Man of Steel. Blue Beetle is part of what I consider loose canon to the upcoming DCU, as Gunn has made it clear that while Zola Mariduena is returning as Jaime Reyes, the movie itself isn't fully canon to the new universe, so seeing as it came out in the DCEU era, I'm counting it for this video, and as such, it's actually one of the better DCEU movies. The plot is certainly very generic, feeling like a mid-2000s superhero origin movie and something we've seen 1,000 times before, and I'd even say that the first portion of the movie, before Jaime gets the suit, is very boring. Still, I can't help but love the character of Blue Beetle. Zolo is perfectly cast and delivers a surprisingly great performance. The Blue Beetle suit is genuinely one of the best adaptations of a comic suit I've ever seen, and the use of Blue Beetle's unique powers is really fun. The villains of the movie certainly leave a lot to be desired, and the side characters are fun but feel very similar to side characters of many other superhero movies. The action, however, is really visceral, brutal, and generally well handled. The movie reaches a level of emotion that the DCEU struggles to reach, and I even think the thematic elements land as well. It's very generic in some areas, but really good in others. It's the rare DCEU movie that leaves me wanting more from its main hero and a follow-up, and it's the only one from 2023 to do so. Wonder Woman is a bit hard to rate because I think it can be split into two different sections that vary wildly in quality. The first 2/3 are great, a really compelling fish-out-of-water tale and love story that perfectly blends together superhero action and awe with wartime darkness and dread, while putting Diana through an arc of discovering that the world is more gray than she thought. Also, the Wonder Woman theme is such a banger, or at least it was until it was overused in a line of terrible cameos. Then comes the third act, which loses almost everything that made the first two acts so great. Ares is revealed to actually have influenced World War I, undoing Diana's arc, and what ensues is a god-awful gray CGI slugfest between Wonder Woman and a weirdly mustachioed Ares before an unearned Steve Trevor sacrifice that feels unnecessary. This quality shift is jarring and left me with a bad taste in my mouth as I left the theater. Still, the rest of the movie was beyond good enough to at least partially make up for it, so while it's not the best DCEU movie, it's certainly above average. I have a bit of a weird relationship with Zack Snyder's Justice League. I didn't think it would ever exist, I didn't necessarily want it to exist, and I doubted it would be any better. It came out, I watched it, liked it far more than I thought I would, and it even got me interested in the potential of this universe going forward, but then I will probably never watch it again. There's no doubt Zack Snyder's Justice League is better than Justice League. It's more coherent in its plot and tone. The characters are far more fleshed out, with Cyborg especially being given an upgrade, shooting up to the best character in the movie. And Steppenwolf is a significantly improved villain with a hugely improved design and very well fleshed out, revamped Zuko-like motivation. Maybe more so than anything, this movie improves on the theatrically released version by making the Justice League act like an actual team, giving them some interesting banter, a cool team-up shot, and making each member important to the final battle, making it feel like no one, not even Superman, could have done it alone. Unfortunately, this movie is 4 goddamn hours long, and it really did not need to be. There's so much unnecessary slow-mo, the scenes go on for so long, there's so much fat that could have been trimmed, and honestly, I would just switch the movie off 10 minutes before the end, because everything after that just did not need to exist, and this is an issue, as it's not easy to watch this in one sitting. The pacing is very slow, and it makes it virtually unrewatchable. There is an ideal middle ground that they never reached between Justice League and Zack Snyder's Justice League, a 3-hour version of this movie that maybe could have been the best movie in the DCEU. Instead, it's at number 5, and while it's still pretty damn good, it's not the best. As previously mentioned, Shazam's biggest issue is that Billy and Shazam feel like 2 separate people in the energy, mannerisms, and dialogue, although it's certainly not nearly as bad in this first one. I would also add that the action and even the cinematography of this movie is pretty bad. Still, there are a few good reasons for why Shazam is so high on this list, despite these issues. For one, while it's easy to forget, Shazam is absolutely hilarious, especially carried by Freddie Freeman, making for easily the funniest DCEU project and one of the funnier comic book movies ever made. This movie is also pretty heartfelt and warm, either through the budding relationship between Billy and his foster family, especially, again, Freddie, or even the sad elements regarding Billy's mom. Then, within this heartfelt comedy is an element of rather affected horror within the villains Dr. Savannah and the 7 Deadly Sins, even if beyond the horror, the villains themselves aren't all that special. While certainly not perfect, Shazam is hilarious and heartfelt, which sets it apart from the rest of the DCEU, and it's definitely very rewatchable. Aquaman is somehow the most successful DCEU movie, and at the same time, it's also one of the best, telling a rather simple but compelling hero's journey. What I love about this movie is how interested it seems to be in its comic book roots. You can see that in the costumes, which from Black Manta to Ocean Master to Aquaman are some of the best comic book movie costumes I've ever seen, all within a beautiful underwater world that never fails to impress me in its visuals. As opposed to his performance in the sequel, Jason Momoa is fantastic in the role of Aquaman here, perfectly conveying a badass nobody who's becoming the king of Atlantis. Combine all that with the fantastic music, and I couldn't help but feel genuinely hyped when his hero's journey came to its conclusion. Aquaman can at times be very cheesy. There are moments of poor acting and a lot of conversations being interrupted by explosions for some reason, but these, in my opinion, are more minor issues in a very, very fun movie that embraces its comic book roots more so than any other in the DCEU. One of the biggest jumps in quality between a movie and its sequel I've ever seen, The Suicide Squad makes literally everything that didn't work in Suicide Squad work, while adding elements the first movie really should have had. The concept of the disposable villains being sent out into an actual suicide mission is used so well, not only in the brutal opening massacre, but also just throughout. You never know when or if someone will die, and as the movie does such a great job of making you care about these characters, it creates such a great feeling of personal stakes, using the concept so perfectly, especially with Rick Flag, arguably the most devastating death scene in the DCEU. Not just the concept, but also the plot, which takes twists and turns outside of the expected, doing far, far more than the bare minimum in both substance and style. The acting, writing, costumes, visuals, cinematography, comedy, music, stakes, twists, and turns are all great, all landing exactly as intended. It's not perfect. While everything is great, I wouldn't say there's much, if anything, that's absolutely exceptional, but it is, without a doubt, in my opinion, the best DCEU movie ever made. Having seen The Suicide Squad, I would not have given Peacemaker out of all characters a spin-off, and honestly, before The Suicide Squad, I'm not sure I ever even heard of this character. But this is a perfect example against the who asked for this argument, as nobody had to ask for it aside from James Gunn to give us one of the best DC shows ever made, and in my opinion, the single best DCEU property. Peacemaker is exceptionally high quality TV with a well thought out, well paced 8-episode plot that expertly explores the character of Peacemaker and his life, as he's played rather well, surprisingly so honestly, by John Cena. The show does a fantastic job of making you care for the main characters, their developing friendships, and their lives. The action and fight scenes are super high quality, the relationship between Peacemaker and his father is really compelling, as the White Dragon makes for a fantastic villain, as do, surprisingly enough, the Butterflies, which is a completely original alien race, but they're also sympathetic and terrifying at the same time. On top of all of that, Vigilante is a blast to watch, and the opening is one of the best in television history. It's pretty promising that the two best DCEU projects just so happen to have been made by the creative head of the new movie universe. I'd say the DCU is in way better hands than the DCEU ever was.